So today I'm going to be talking with Scott Legere. Scott is the co-founder of Nowhere Media, a TEDx speaker, and a Grammy-nominated engineer. And we're going to be talking about a major change happening in all industries that really focuses on a shift in how the workforce operates. I think that post-millennials really need to be aware of this shift if they aren't already. So I want to set the groundwork first that my readers have a variety of professional aspirations, and this concept is just as relevant in the marketing or educational or managerial industry as it is in the music industry. This really is a multi-industry shift. So to get us started, I want you to kind of talk about how your timeline went, what jobs you've had, and your kind of experience in not following the classic career timeline.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sitting down and having this conversation, Sabrina. And you mentioned that I'd be sharing my opinion. That is exactly what I will share. And opinion is always slanted and personal. I'll try to be as universal as possible, but grain of salt with everything. I didn't inherently set out to have a non-traditional career, right? Or to have something that didn't fit that mold of enter in the mailroom, stay 40 years, and retire with the gold watch. I might have done that had I been given the opportunity. But as I came into the music business at the end of the 90s, what I then witnessed was the industry flipping upside down 3, 4, 5, 6 times through different technological innovations that changed consumer behavior, that changed business practice. And so I like to joke that I'm nothing more than a keyboard player trying to stay employed. But then what's interesting is that classic curse, may you live in interesting times. I got into the studio business right as digital recording moved from being a very expensive $50,000 endeavor to every band can spend $800 and record at home. Yeah. I got into the label business following that, right as digital sales really took off and the iPod took off, and we watched, working at a label, watched our Excel spreadsheets and our graphs. Sales were strong, and then almost overnight they weren't. You used to have 100 records sell in Sweden. Well, now you're getting streamed 10,000 times in Sweden, which from an artistic and message point of view is super exciting. But you'd literally go from, in any given territory, all right, we're making $400 a month, $500 a month, maybe $800 a month, to you're making $5 a month. And it's that drastic because, well, it's a deep story. Then I moved into audio post-production where, presumptively I would be doing jingles and that sort of thing, writing music for brands, and we're watching the brand world do one of two things: either start to make 15 and 6-second commercials because they're going to start those commercials on mobile devices and then later put them on television, or you're doing some crazy virtual reality, manifesto style, longer form video that's radically different than anything you imagined, right? We went from, in a matter of a year or two, from doing 1-minute television commercials to suddenly working with some brands who said, listen, we, instead of doing a television spot, we want to have 22 separate videos all launching through Instagram. Oh, so my perspective is shaped, at least in the music space, from constantly looking over my shoulder and trying not to get hit by the proverbial falling piano. And then trying to understand that change forced me to educate myself, forced me to start paying attention and reading and attending conferences. And it's through that exploration that I started to see and recognize that this, what we call the contingent workforce, where you're working in some fashion of freelance or gig to gig, this isn't just happening in music, it's happening all over the place.
So this wasn't scripted, but what you talked about a lot is that technology is what's driving this. Every time there was some sort of innovation in the industry, you had to change, right? Mm-hmm. And so do you think that that's a major part or the biggest part, or is it some sort of, social thing that's driving this?
Well, so here's what's interesting is, and maybe I'll do this later semester in your class, I have a really dumb lecture that sort of takes you through the mood ring of what the early aughts were, right? It's interesting. In 1999, you have the highest peak of physical CD sales, which is just the pinnacle of the boy bands and Britney Spears and that whole thing. And then it all starts to change. But from an industry standpoint, if you have a really great year and then you have a flat year or sales dip 5%, you don't necessarily panic. You don't necessarily pull the fire alarm and radically change your business plan. You say, whoa, well, that's interesting. Let's try to be more efficient. Let's try to sign some more artists. And your initial reaction to change in a large industry setting is often just some pragmatic decisions. Let's watch our budgets and let's try to double down on talent acquisition. But by 2004, 2005, at that rate, consumers were switching so quickly to digital areas that you saw sales going from a 5% dip, maybe over that hump in 2000, 2001, suddenly negative 15%, negative 18%, negative 14%, and there was literally panic in the streets. And no one really knew what was going on. And there was a famous interview with Doug Morris, the then CEO of Universal Music Group, in Wired magazine. And the reporter, you're at Wired, you're aware of technology and aware of those things, was sort of chiding Doug Morris. Doug, you're a smart guy. You run a huge company. You should be able to figure out what's going on. And Doug just said, but this is generational. This is different than my behavior. I don't understand it. And if you handed me 20 technologists with 20 resumes, I wouldn't know what those resumes said.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting perspective. And for a long time, we didn't understand what was happening. We now have a pretty good idea of what's happening. And it's not just technological. Technology is empowering new social behavior.
Right.
Underlying all of these things are incredibly predictable human behaviors. The human desire to communicate, the human desire to share, human appreciation of a whole bunch of efficiencies and things like that. So now, looking back on that decade, it makes a lot of sense of what's happened. And what's exciting is that only recently, seeing that change, understanding that change, companies are now very much playing into that change with new strategies, new business models. We know where the world is going now, so let's play to it. In the music side, okay, the format is streaming. And the only format that will replace that is somehow better, maybe higher def, maybe surround, maybe richer video-enabled streaming.
Right.
But it's streaming nonetheless. Okay, time to start building business plans and approaches towards that rather than, a decade ago, panic in the streets. You don't know what's going on. You don't know who to fire, who to hire. But we're witnessing, empowered by technology, probably the biggest economic tectonic-like shift globally since the printing press.
Right.
You look at what the printing press did, changing the power of the church and royalties and empowering citizens, communities, towns, and we call the period after the printing press the Renaissance. Then understanding that the internet is the biggest printing press in the world, it's global and it's instantaneous. We're going to see amazing things coming out around the world, radically reshaping business, culture, art, society. And I'm an optimist, sure, but often in incredibly powerful and positive ways.
Right. So what you're saying is that essentially right now, we've passed the time where this shift is terrifying, and what we're entering is, like you said, sort of like a renaissance where instead of fear, people are starting to realize how interesting and exciting this change is, right? So that kind of leads into what you had mentioned in class, and I've heard you talk about before, is this idea now of career versus livelihood. And can you just expound briefly on what that means for all industries, really?
So the traditional mindset that we had for much of the industrialized United States is that You studied a subject, you focused on that subject. Hopefully you picked something in college that was near and dear to your heart. And then a career was how you leverage that knowledge and information for the next 50, 60 years until you retired with your gold watch. Then a couple of 50 years of history happened through that. Post-Great Recession, a lot of the efficiencies that companies found was getting rid of middle management. And that process had been starting earlier. There's been lots of news reporting taking a hard look and using, clickbait headlines, but, the extinction of the white male. White males made up a huge portion of middle management, right? Yeah. If you have technological innovation, if you have efficiency, if you have ubiquitous sharing of documents and processes and time cards and barcodes, through technology, you can eliminate a whole swath of what middle management used to be. I saw a statistic recently that more than 60% of U.S. tax returns will ultimately be filed in India, right? So you're filling out your TurboTax, you're hitting enter, it's right. Being studied and analyzed probably by an incredibly smart CPA in another country.
Everything's global.
Right. Okay. So guess what? Your company can do with a lot fewer accountants and legal aids and. So now if you get rid of middle management, you have this really interesting bifurcation in the corporate structure. You have worker bees, and then you have the corporate executive suite. And there really isn't a direct path between them. And so even before we start talking about creative careers, you have this really interesting system in corporate America across lots of industries where you can't start at the bottom and go straight to the top because they chopped out the middle. And so then the only way to ascend is to hop to a different company at a higher pay rate and a higher responsibility thing. And so I've seen this in advertising, I've seen this in other fields where the average tenure, the amount of time you spend at one company, has, been cut by a fifth. Maybe you'd stay 10 or 20 years someplace. Now you're staying 2, 3, you're getting some new qualifications under your belt, you're getting some portfolio work you can show for it. But then in that company, there might be no other place to ascend to besides boss. So you've got to hop somewhere else to move up the ladder. The ladder isn't one ladder. You're hopping from one ladder to another, slowly trying to get a rung or 2 or 3 up. Or if you can't ascend anymore, you jump off the ladder and start your own thing, right? Having equity in a business is really the place where you can have the most creative control, the most strategic freedom, and probably in the long run make the most money. So again, this is happening all over the place. The other thing is, though, if you talk about strictly career, even when we go back to maybe my dad's generation who started in the trenches at Quaker Oats, in one small division and stayed, I think, for 30 odd years, you still tell the next generation, or you have this perception of a straight line. Nothing in life is a straight line. You might try this responsibility, well, your boss didn't like so you got, if you just talk about career, you have to realize that even in the course of a year, the course of a month, there are challenges, there are obstacles, there are successes, there are failures, there's that one deal that didn't work out, right? So life is never a straight line. And even if you stayed within one company, you're never in the same lane every day or for multiple years. And so there's been a push to try and help young people realize that life is kind of like bumper pool. And then you take into account today's economic structure where straight lines are simply, they don't exist anymore. Then we take into some of the societal things where we tell you and your peers, hey, the world is your oyster. You're now more motivated by interest and idealism than maybe the rote need to go get a job. And if you log into a monster.com, an Indeed, or any of the job sites out there, you'll see tens of thousands of listings.
Yeah.
That, whether or not you qualified for all of them, that gives you a perspective that this actually isn't about jobs. There are plenty of jobs out there. This is about, well, which one does Sabrina pick? Which one does Timothy pick? And that's where we're at now. And I think that's incredibly healthy to base the 70 years of your adult life on interest and passion. I think that's good for you. And I think if you're pursuing things that excite you, you bring positivity to those around you. That means productivity within the company is likely to rise because there's people on the same page. There's shared visioning. There's shared mission. And while I'm talking sort of at a 30,000-foot level, because of technological change, because of economic change, traditional routes aren't what they used to be. And so you realize that the traditional career path down one sector of industry or one sector of business involves a whole lot of jumping. At some point, you're going to jump and not land at another company, but decide, you know what? I always missed cooking with my parents, or I was always into gardening, or I really want to do this in my community. And at least with my peers, I'm seeing everybody peel off from whatever they had been doing, and they're starting a bicycle company. They're starting a brewery. They're starting a film project. They're kickstartering a new technology. We used to call this a midlife crisis. But then it started happening more often to most people. So we didn't call it a midlife crisis because sometimes it happened at 30, not 40.
Or when you're 20.
Or when you're 20.
For that matter.
So now it's a pivot. And guess what? We're all just going to keep pivoting. And I think the most important thing to realize is that pivoting inherently is scary. Changing direction is inherently scary, whether in work or in relationships or whatever it might be. But if we're at least aware it's going to happen, we're a little bit more prepared. We can think, how do we nurture and sustain ourselves through pivots? And I think that's what we need to do for the next generation. And it's not something I coined, but a lot of educators in industry are talking about livelihood, where it's a constant decision of what do I want to be doing with my time? What sustains me personally? Of course, what sustains me financially, right? We don't live in a socialist structure, so we still have to have driving income. But we're seeing a lot of situations where younger generations are making different sacrifices or making different decisions that play more to their own interests than something more traditional. Right. I don't think that indicates any lack of passion, integrity, or work ethic for the next generation. I think there are just so many more broader opportunities that you'll go after what interests you most. And while that's hard for traditional business to plan for, these young people, they keep peeling off and they don't want to stay 20 years. Ultimately, I think that will help American innovation. I think that will help creativity. I think that will help society.
So I'm hearing when you're talking two different things. You said passion a lot, and I think that that's something that's really exciting, and that post-millennials, that we should really be taking advantage of this, because to me, what I'm hearing is, now you're not stuck to any one passion. I can go out there and I can pursue music. I can pursue writing. I can meld them all together. And so maybe then, instead of having a midlife crisis, I'm having all of these different outlets, of creativity and excitement. And maybe in the long run, I'm staying more engaged by jumping around than someone would ever have staying in one position.
Right. That's just it. And that's how productivity and real corporate gains could come from this new paradigm, is that a happy worker is theoretically a more productive worker. It's interesting. One of the treatises of American literature and business analysis came from the researcher Studs Terkel, and he wrote a book called Working. And I think this was the early 1970s. He just went across the country and found people from a whole bunch of different pursuits and interviewed them. What's it like? And he went to Detroit, and he went to the good jobs, the blue-collar jobs that we've talked so much about in recent national discussion. And yes, you could grow up in and around Michigan. You could come from the Midwest and walk into one of these factories owned by one of these American titans of industry. And you could stay for 40 years and retire at a really healthy hourly wage. But when Studs Terkel went and interviewed some of these people, and lots of other researchers have done similar work, you do hear that employees admitted, well, this is boring.
Yeah.
This is monotonous. You zone out, and that actually creates a dangerous environment in a factory setting. Yes, there was the perception or potential for some easier jobs and job paths for previous generations. But 30, 40 years in, how satisfied did those humans feel working on that line, right? Now, I have noticed something that's a caveat to my optimism for young people. Passion is critical, but the business world also demands attention to detail, professional decorum, and also patience. I know lots of situations where young millennials enter a workplace and for a variety of reasons are disenfranchised. Well, it was boring coming to work, or I wasn't challenged, or the boss didn't listen to me, or it was very tedious, and then they quit quickly, right? Where you're looking at 6 months in and you decide to leave. I don't think that is necessarily healthy, and I try to remind people, don't make long-term decisions on short-term data, right? So a couple of months of dissatisfaction should not make you give up on something, because as we have discussed in class this semester, we're seeing more and more research that highlights how tenacity and grit are crucial to quote-unquote success, right? Developing a reputation, growing, being able to monetize that reputation at growing levels. But you said something very interesting, which I think is incredibly salient on this. You can make music and you can write and you can do all of these things because it seems like they're related now. They really are. Everybody now is a media company. You're the bakery down the street, you're a media company. There was a great, the story's about 8 or 9 years old, and Neil Young, the musician, bought Lionel Trains. And, the paper that interviewed him, I can't remember if it was the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, sort of was giving him a hard time, being a little indignant. Why did you just buy a bankrupt toy train company? And he said, I didn't buy a train company. I bought a media brand. And Lionel Trains, this thing that I bought, can exist in YouTube videos. It can exist in events. It can exist in magazines. It can exist in online communities where there's blogging and sharing and social media talk of building trains, train history. And if you think about it, you can take just about any company and realize that it could have 100 different media tendrils around it. And how do we communicate today? In media. So you can take the most traditional mom and pop store on the corner, but that store, whatever it sells, whatever it produces, has the opportunity, and it's a dumb word, to be global.
Yeah. Right?
You're a local company, but you put your wares, your services on the internet, you're instantaneously global for almost no increase in production cost across a lot of industries. So if you get excited about music and you get excited about writing, you could apply those passions to almost any brand. Apple needs music. Pepsi needs music. Lay's potato chips needs music. The University of Minnesota needs music in their commercials to talk about their new whatever it is. Everybody's a media brand, which then tells us almost every undergraduate should be a digitalist on some level, because that is almost the new liberal arts. That is almost the new diversity and understanding of human communication. The web, social media, visual, all of those things.
So I want to really emphasize the point that you made. When we say livelihood, we don't mean 20 different careers in the span of 15 years. That's not what we mean. You have to, like you're saying, you have to establish yourself. And this is a great opportunity for post-millennials to go into a position, stay for a while, and just suck all the marrow out of what they can learn from that and move somewhere. And you're not taking advantage of a position or a learning environment if you're jumping, if you're too busy jumping. So I really do want to emphasize that point. And then also something that we both kind of touched on is the melding power, whether that is like creative stuff. So you're a writer, you're a singer, maybe you're also into culinary. There's so many different aspects of every industry that can be stretched or used elsewhere. Even if you're in the medical industry, you're working with caring for people, and that compassion that can be used anywhere, right? So there's this idea that post-millennials, you have to learn in today's age how to use all of your tiny little skills in every sort of environment. And so what I want to take this from here is another thing that I think is really important to talk about is when you are in all of these different learning environments, which is kind of what a career is or a job, how you can grow as a person. And, humans are not machines. And I think that that's why people are starting to realize you can't do the same thing over and over and over and over happily for years, right? So I kind of want to have you talk about if you felt like having multiple careers ultimately made you grow as a person.
Unquestionably. Different experiences open you up to new opportunities, new ideas, new people, new ways of thinking. And it's interesting having, and there's been research on this, and people have been sort of pushing at the edges of the importance of the arts. But I have a 5-year-old daughter, and she loves to sing, she loves to dance, she loves to draw, she loves to make things. And I think that is a really true look at an unfettered human spirit. Then you go through a traditional education system and you start taking a human's desire to be creative and put that against, well, Monet was a better painter or so-and-so was a better singer. We often do, and there's great TED Talks on this, we often do teach the creativity out of young people. And ultimately, in some senses, tell you that your value is based on your math and reading skills. Those are inherently important skills, but I really do believe that the true nature of the human spirit involves creativity. Now, what's fun, in a changing world, every company on the planet needs to be more creative and needs to learn how to adapt, how to bend. And creativity is a hard word. It doesn't mean that you're going to walk into a Fortune 500 and start singing and they're going to value that immediately. But as I've had to up my skill set, I realize that in many ways, you can be as creative in business as you can in lyrics. You can be as creative teaching as you can maybe arranging a song. And having to pivot, having to hop, or feeling an itch to pivot and hop because you've learned your fill at a previous place just means that you have another place to go and exercise creativity. Another faculty here, Jan Weller, her son's in a growing touring band, and when he's off the road, he has found a job that he really enjoys at a mixology bar and finds tremendous creativity building, creating, and sharing new drinks in an offset to building, creating, and sharing songs, right? So maybe what we're letting humans do in this new era or paradigm is to a degree being a little bit more human. Again, I think that's a huge win. We can't dissolve rules of the workplace. Society demands lots of tedious attention to details we talked about earlier, whether it's insurance, whether it's legal issues, whether it's just decorum. But I think it's really exciting if we're preparing young people to understand you're going to pivot and turn and try and say yes and fail, but it's not a failure because you're learning from it and grow, and that is a lot more of what the workforce is going to look like rather than well, there's an opening over here. I'm going to go over there, and I'll see you in 40 years.
Right. So in closing, all of this is a big deal, and it's a big change, even for people who are young like me. We've watched parents, grandparents, like you said, step away from jobs where they've had something that is also important, I think, sometimes to humans is some sort of reliability, right? Mm-hmm. So what would you say to people who are intimidated by this or afraid of this change and don't really know what to do?
I think that's one of the biggest conversations missing in our political discourse today. The American workforce, the areas of opportunity, the industries of opportunity in America are changing. And even where the jobs are located is certainly changing, right? My friends, my colleagues in a city, we are not for want of work. When I talk to friends, it's, well, I might go do this. I might go do that. It's based on the fact that there are plenty of jobs in certain growing metro areas, but frankly, not nearly as many in some smaller communities. That's not an easy thing to rectify. And I can't drive across rural America and say, well, it's easy, just drive to a city. And maybe some of the creatives who peel off the corporate structure in cities will launch their next venture in the rural areas. So, but we need to understand this. More and more and more of the workforce will look different. We need to have families that are supporting young people. We need to have young people that are prepared for it. We also need to have social services in the United States that can help bridge maybe times of insecurity. One benefit of the gig-to-gig economy is that you're often doing multiple things at a time. And if you have 5 jobs and you lose one, you still have 4 others.
Right. Not the world.
Right, there's some security there, but what have we done for many, many years? We've tied healthcare to a long-standing job. There was a corporate agreement. Sabrina, we're going to borrow your time, and we're going to demand a lot of it, but we're going to reward you with healthcare. We're going to reward you with a 401k, and there's going to be all of these benefits. And I think that's another thing that some people are starting to recognize as healthcare changes, as benefits packages lessen, and all of those things materialize because companies are trying to save costs and compete globally. The great corporate bargain might not be the same for your generation as it was for previous. So then, how do we support healthcare? How do we support working later in life if you're not going to have a rich 401k that you start putting money into when you're 21? There's a lot of unanswered societal questions. But I still think for those who are living it, it represents opportunity, it represents excitement, and it also represents, you might have gone through school and you weren't good at math or you weren't good at reading, but the world demands so many creative solutions to today's problems that more and more humans, if they look harder, not harder, but if they're looking and supported by those around them, they might find actually not just where's the easy job, but where could they really be impactful and have a good fit.
Alrighty. Well, I want to thank you, Scott, again for talking with us today. And if you have any questions about this or would like information for Scott or anything on further topics on the blog, feel free to go to the contact page, type in your comments and send them right at me, or subscribe whenever you feel like doing it. See you later.